Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video in the Cosmic Towers Science series. In the last video, we talked about how sound waves can give rise to shapes and forms with the example of cymatics. And this also happens on higher levels in the ether itself. So in order to understand that, we first have to look at the different types of waves that exist. Now, most people are familiar with what is called a transversal wave, where the wave moves perpendicular to the motion. And an example of this would be if you take a rope and you create a wave in it, that wave will travel through that rope. So what we know is electromagnetic waves are a form of transversal waves. They were discovered by Hertz in 1888, and they actually do that in two planes. So you have the electrical plane, and then you, at a 90-degree angle, you have the magnetic plane. And just like with a rope, how you create the wave will decrease in density as it gets further from the source. The same is true for electromagnetic waves. Now, then there's also what we call longitudinal waves. And with longitudinal waves, the waves move along the direction of motion. And the best example of a longitudinal wave is a sound wave, right? Where you have a pressure that moves through the air. But other examples of longitudinal waves are scalar waves and torsion waves. And what is important to understand here is what Tesla referred to, how the ether is many thousand times more dense than air. And then he also pointed out that the denser a substance is, the higher is the speed of the wave propagation. So it's a crude analogy, but you could look then at it as the ether as almost being like a nail. So if you hit a nail with a hammer, that energy and that wave gets, transmitted almost instantaneously because a nail has a much higher density than the air. So you could really look at longitudinal compression waves in the ether where there's different densities as inaudible sound waves that are moving in the subtle energy spectrum. So let's take a look at scalar waves real quick, because there's a lot of talk about scalar waves. And scalar waves are actually a special form of longitudinal waves that are produced by taking two electromagnetic waves of the same spectrum and then shifting them 180 degrees out of phase. And what happens then is that those waves will cancel each other out, right? But the result of that is that that energy that's present in those waves, it is transformed back into scalar waves. And it's a, you could kind of look at it if you take a bottle of water and you apply the same pressure on both sides inward, right? That water that has to go somewhere, so it squirts out. So you could almost look at scalar waves as the same principle, but then on an electromagnetic level, to where that energy is transferred into scalar waves, into longitudinal compression waves. And in this case, it's resulting from the effects of moving currents in our environment. And what's important to know is that these scalar waves can move at speeds slower or also faster than light. So Tesla discovered the electric scalar waves around the 1890s, and then he used those in his patent of the transmission of electrical energy in 1900. So this has been around for a very long time. And then Konstantin Mile has also focused a lot on scalar waves and done a lot of experiments and research, especially with the magnetic scalar waves. So remember, the denser a substance is, the higher is the speed of wave propagation. This explains why in Konstantin Mile's experiments, he was able to confirm some of these important but non-traditional properties of scalar waves. And He found many different properties and he's pointed out many things, but I'm just going to focus on a few here that are relevant to our series. So first of all, he discovered that you could have wireless transmission of electrical energy, as was already pointed out and proven by Nikola Tesla, and also that there was a reaction of the receiver to the transmitter. So there is an exchange of information between the transmitter and the receiver. Then he also found out that these scalar waves can travel at 1.5 times the speed of light, so faster than light transmission of energy and information. And then one very important other attribute is the inefficiency of a Faraday cage to shield from these scalar waves. And this becomes really important when we look at the effects of man-made technology, because we cannot shield ourselves from the scalar wave component. Now, nature also uses the magnetic scalar wave to for communication, and this actually explains why 10,000 different biochemical transactions can occur in each and every cell every second. And this is a process that can simply not be explained by mainstream chemistry through chemical reactions, but it can be explained when we know that waves can transfer energy and information. So scalar waves are a special form of these longitudinal waves. Now, if we look at longitudinal compression waves in general, there are many attributes, and this is a really big field of study, but I'm just going to point out a few important attributes that are relevant to this series. As we already talked, longitudinal compression waves can move faster than the speed of light. What is really important also is that they carry the quality of its source all throughout the environment. So you can imagine in the case of man-made technology that that's really not a good thing. So several researchers today support the theory that the Earth's own energy grids are a form of longitudinal scalar waves. And we really have to look at these longitudinal waves in a more holistic way in nature, that they encompass all these qualitative components and that they also move along the spiritual, mental, and the emotional planes, forming this weave of multi-dimensional wave patterns that you could look at as the universal storehouse of all the information from which all of creation emerges and then returns to. And then lastly, any linear motion of any type will create secondary, so longitudinal compression waves of motion. And you could look at a ship going through the water, right? You will have on the right side, you have clockwise waves forming, and on the left side, you have counterclockwise waves that are forming. And this is an important aspect to consider, that any motion in the ether will create these secondary forms of rotating motion, and these secondary motions are then in the form of longitudinal compression waves. So let's go back to our creation levels. So science tries to look at the 1% at the electromagnetic spectrum and then figure out the whole. And we actually have to reverse this process. So many spiritual traditions, they talk about the word, right? And the word being a vibration, and how it also infused all the resulting vibrations from it with all the attributes that are present in the primordial state, in the source from which it emerged. So you could look at the word as this vibration, then radiating all throughout the universe as subtle hidden qualities that are carried on all kinds of waves, and weaving a pattern, right, as they go into resonance of all the created things as we know them. So if you look here at the whole spectrum, life force actually comes from the source and then travels all the way down to the spiritual plane, the mental plane, the emotional plane. It gets all the way slowed down to the speed of light, where we then find the Big Bang that scientists consider the beginning of everything from nothing. But if you look at it from a more holistic perspective, it's actually much later in the process that this happened, because these waves has been slowed down all the way to the speed of light. And then when we get into the physical plane, this is where this life force animates all of life. And then as this further decays, it moves into the sub-physical spectrum, into the electromagnetic dimensions. So it's really important to understand that these waves, also travel through the spiritual, mental, and emotional, so the subtle planes, and they do so there at speeds faster than the speed of light, and also at different speeds depending on which level that you're looking at in the subtle spectrum. So this, in a way, explains how we get this whole weave of multidimensional wave patterns, being that storehouse of information from which all creation as we know it emerges and returns to. So one important aspect to remind you of is that the subtle waves affect the physical plane, but so do the sub-physical, so does the sub-physical plane affect the physical plane. And then the subtle plane affects the sub-physical plane, and vice versa, right? So everything is connected and affects each other, something we all know from the spiritual traditions, but science hasn't quite wrapped their head around this yet. So let's look at a practical example of this. And while this is still very much in the electromagnetic spectrum, it does give us a good idea of how we should change our model. So this is a Soviet experiment from 1976, actually the year I was born, and it shows the ability of electromagnetic waves to transmit disease signatures between living tissues. So they had two quartz Petri dishes that were then shielded by a wall, but then there was a quartz window in between them. And what they noticed, how death signals could be transmitted from an infected to an uninfected chicken embryo. And even though, on a physical level, there were no particles of disease present in the uninfected chicken embryo, the experiment still demonstrated that the dying cells of the one Petri dish were able to really emit the template of the disease, which then induced the same condition in the healthy cells in the other Petri dish through electromagnetic waves. And there's been over 5,000 experiments that have been done about this, and this really shifts our understanding about health and illness. So knowing this, we really have to switch into a new health paradigm, which is that all wave radiating sources, which includes all living beings, but also chemical toxins, electromagnetic radiations, are constantly energetically transmitting their qualities and interacting with and reinforcing one another. And this fundamentally changes our paradigm of creating health and illness, because the detrimental waves in the environment, they will amplify the same types of harmful waves in living energy systems within that environment, and vice versa. And this is now happening continuously with the destructive waves that are created by electromagnetic, modern technologies, which can transmute a harmless living systems to become highly toxic. But what's important is that by accepting this reality, we can also fundamentally change our paradigm of how we can create health. right? Because just like there are waves of illness that are being transmitted through our environment and affecting all living organisms, so we can also create waves of health that are transmitted and that can counteract or transmute these energetic waves of illness that are present in our environment. And this really opens up a whole new realm of possibilities that also connects us more to the lost wisdom that earlier cultures were aware of. And they used a much more expanded paradigm that is now used, or should I say allowed, in particle-based modern allopathic medicine. So we'll be diving deeper into this in further videos. But thank you for watching this video. And if you like it, give it a thumbs up or leave a comment. We always appreciate your participation. Thank you and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.